So, and that's obviously one of the trade-offs between centralized control and decentralized control is the decentralization, it takes longer. You need consensus and all this stuff as opposed to centralized. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So there's both. Cardano does some very cool, interesting things. And one of the things they did here was this thing called liquid democracy. What you can do here is then you can delegate your voting power to a DREP, and then they would vote with their commutative voting power. But then you can actually change your delegation if you really find the person's not doing what you want them to do. So I think that's profound, because obviously with our parliamentary system today, you vote somebody in office and then they go off and do something, whatever they want to do, until they get the next voting, next round. If you think of a match made in heaven, governance and blockchain, they really are suited, because you just there's no lying, right? You know what your basically your DREP voted on, and then you can trace stuff. You can figure out where things went. And this is one of Cardano's strengths, is the fact that it is, again, never gone down, never been hacked. It's extremely resilient. Those are the properties that when you're looking for an immutable ledger that's always accessible, that's what you're looking for. And that's why I think Cardano is going to find probably the product fit. It isn't the fastest chain out there. Now, there is some improvements that may change things, but that's down the road. We don't know. Laos is a research paper they have on really increasing the speed, and theoretically it looks pretty promising, but we'll see. So I took kind of the road that, look, my objective is just how do you make it easier to build on Cardano, and that was really what the book focused on. So I made some very choice decisions. I didn't talk about Haskell for writing smart contracts, because I don't find that a very easy way to onboard developers. Haskell I'm okay with, it's fine, but you're going to get way better traction and way better dev experience with using languages that people are familiar with. I think it's cool. Like Toronto, it's one of these places where you're lucky to be here because you have all of this talent in here. Meetups are probably the best thing to do, both from the networking perspective. Get the inside scoop, not the sales scoop, right? It's early days, but there's no question that Cardano and Bitcoin have a good synergy, because they both deal with UTXO architecture, which is different than your account-based. So, from a user perspective, it would be a seamless experience. You would still be on Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin would go to an address, but that address would map to the smart contract on the Cardano side. And then, so the Cardano is where then the DeFi would happen. And then conversely, if you want to then get your amount back, you basically, there would be a corresponding address on the Bitcoin side.
Hello, you've just heard from Professor Lawrence Ley, one of the visionaries teaching blockchain development at Toronto's George Brown College. He's a Cardano enthusiast, organizing local meetups that I've found an essential part of my settling in here in Canada. Professor Ley is a published author, having written the definitive book for onboarding new smart contract developers into the Cardano ecosystem. We get into both the basics and the nuances of the Cardano network, as well as a few key developments that are being put in place. This episode is chock full of insight and absolutely unmissable for the governance enthusiasts among us. So some quick foundational knowledge to catch you up. Cardano is a pre-2020 cryptocurrency, and its most prominent figure is Charles Hoskinson. He was involved in the earliest iterations of Ethereum. Cardano has consistently been among the top 10 cryptocurrencies, despite not really being part of any of the hype cycles in recent memory. There was no real ICO boom there, and there was very sparse involvement in both the NFT and the meme coin movement. This network is universally praised for the quality of its technology. This is the result of a lot of peer-reviewed academic involvement, which is a slower but surer process that seems to be at odds with the build fast, break stuff mentality that the crypto space is kind of known for right now. The main token is ADA, named after the mathematician Ada Lovelace. Each era of development is also named after literary geniuses, so if you hear names like Shelley, Gauguin, and Basho, this is what's being discussed. But before I get into the episode, I want to thank all the mentors from my previous episode with Dr. Kate Withers of Functionland. We spoke about decentralized storage, and it was one of my most collected episodes so far. Your names are all on the screen right now. Thank you so much for all of your support. And here's the leaderboard. For those who've minted over half of my episodes, you get a special shout out. Sorry in advance for the name butchering. We have Web3 Ninjas, Rudra, Wick3, Crypto Bardo, Pedro Villela, AI SEB, Frenchie, Atomatomo, Base Students, 0x Alden, Wiscott, and Lynx. A friendly reminder to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite player. Apple and Spotify listeners especially, please rate the show. It'll do us a massive favor for visibility. If you're living life on chain, each episode can be collected right into your wallet on Pods Media. So with all that done, let's get into the episode of Is This the New Internet? This one's a Cardano special, and without any further ado, I present to you Professor Lawrence Ley. Professor Lawrence Ley, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Marvin. Thank you for having me. This is great.
You have a storied history in this space, but let's wind it all back a little bit. Could you tell us, how did you get into blockchain? Did you have a life in the tech space before the blockchain world? So how did you come to this current state and this current part of your life where you are right now?
Well, so my previous life, as I would call it, as many in the crypto space, I was in IT for large corporations like Rogers and Bell and TD. I did consulting work for about a decade of that. And so I did IT consulting and project management and managed application development teams. So my background is application development for over 20 years. So I'm quite strong in that capability. But about around 2013 or 14, came across this thing called Bitcoin. And I thought, this is pretty cool. And I've always been a very technical person, right? So I've always liked Linux. Early adopter. I was basically compiling Linux kernels to create, so I could create my own sound system and do recording and stuff like that, because you needed like a high-end kernel to make sure that you wouldn't get any kind of cracks in the audio. So I just did that for fun, right? And then programming myself, I've started when I was like in grade 5. My teacher at the time, again, this goes way back in the 80s with, TRS-80 is what we used. Our teacher was, he bought his own computer for the class. And so I started programming back then. So I've always had a love of technology and programming in particular. And so that's why I actually then I did computer science eventually. I did a bit of a wandering path, but eventually landed in computer science. And then out of that, I started at Rogers and stayed there for many years. And so that was, my upbringing on technology and then learning how to develop applications. But really, so when it came to blockchain, I said, oh, this is so cool. I can really dig into this. And what's the best thing about blockchain, I find, is the fact that it is open source by and large, and it's permissionless. So anyone can do it. You don't need to talk to anyone. Well, can I do this? And you just go ahead and do it. So that was great. So with Bitcoin, basically, the fact that anyone could just download the node and start participating. And then I said, well, okay, I want to do more than that. Let me try mining. I think that is so cool. So then I, of course, went down that rabbit hole and started buying some miners and started mining Bitcoin and said, this is the coolest thing ever. And I was just telling every friend I had, this is great. And they all thought I was nuts, which is common. What that led to is then, because I'm in Toronto, is that I like to talk to other people that know about Bitcoin. And so then I came across some of these meetups. And then Toronto itself, again, I've been here for many years now. And it just has an amazing community of Web3 people. And so these are early days, right, of Bitcoin, back 2013, 2014. So I thought that would be just kind of funny to actually just show up and say, hey, I'm a Bitcoin miner. What do you do? And so so I go to this meetup and it's Decentral. And it's basically on Spadina. And I really don't know anyone there at all. But the room is packed, probably like 200, 300 people in it. And I went to like one or two, or maybe two or three of these. And Anthony Delorio was the guy that was running it. And there was something about Ethereum. And I was going, oh, okay, well, what's this? And so hey, you go talk to this guy, Vitalik. Oh, really? He's in the back. So I'm just there with my beer in hand. And I just go to the back room and And there's this guy called Vitalik, and I said, well, can you tell me a little bit about these smart contracts? What's that about? And he told me, and I remember, at the time going, yeah, okay, I guess it could work. And then, went along my way. Obviously, I was more into Bitcoin, and but that was my introduction to smart contracts. So again, only in Toronto could you just kind of happen to just show up at a meeting, and then obviously they're doing this Ethereum token launch, and there's a lot of other people there that probably that are quite famous now that I didn't even realize at the time. So I'm just a small player, right? I'm a small fish, but the fact that you're just swimming with these big whales is quite amusing. So that's really where's my start in crypto. And so it's a pretty neat experience there.
Oh, that's fantastic. So actually a previous guest in the podcast, Lisana Gaib, he also mentioned the Decentral meetups in similar glowing terms. So it's really refreshing to see how small yet huge the scene is over here. It's so deeply interconnected.
Yeah.
If you're doing stuff, you're going to find so many opportunities to meet other people doing similar things. So what's that been like? So how's your journey been through, is there anything else that made you feel like, okay, wow, this is where I would like to commit a lot more time? Was there a moment that you felt that?
Well, so it intertwines with kind of my life experiences as well, right? So after being in the IT space for over 20 years and managing very stressful projects and always having to follow orders, right? Get things done. And I did a good job at that. The fact that you just had a bit more liberty to kind of explore and experiment, and you didn't need to get that permission. You could just try stuff, really resonated. So basically, I've been focusing pretty much on that for the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years now. And then Cardano kind of came on the scene. And it was funny because I've got a family, so he was busy. So, the Bitcoin thing was part-time. And then obviously there's a big crash in 2018 and stuff like that. And I remember you just go, okay, let's just put that away. And I remember walking away saying that was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done, but clearly it wasn't. And then obviously it came back, right? The price. And that's really got me interested in oh, Jesus. Well, maybe there's something to this thing. And so then I actually started looking at staking because I heard about this idea. So, well, that's got it. Yeah, because it's just like sitting there. It's dead weight. How do we get some income? And so then that's when I started looking around at staking. And so obviously there's like Celsius and these other things. I was going, well, I don't know if that's a really good idea. It kind of defeats the purpose, right? And so that's where I came across Cardano. I said, well, okay, a native layer 1 protocol that you can do staking. And then so I kind of went down that rabbit hole that probably many people do, and was really kind of just gravitated to, well, this is actually, it's not move fast and break things. It's let's try to build this correctly and smartly and make it secure and reliable and resilient and all these good things. And so that kind of got me really focused on Cardano after my Bitcoin kind of experiences. And that's kind of when I jumped over to Cardano. And even though I obviously had some influences of Ethereum, I just, again, partly work-wise, my contracts, I was very busy, so I wasn't in the space there at the time, just because I had other commitments and obligations.
That's right. So all my friends over here love to say that I'm a Cardano maxi. I'm sure after listening to this podcast, they'll know who the real maxi is. So could you tell me a little about the process of, translating it from, you've got all this information, you have all this excitement for what this could be. How was that process of translating this into real world meetups, organizing with actual people, and creating a community for yourself around this?
Well, so it is kind of one of those things where it's a bit of a dominoes. So it just was so happened that good friend John McPherson's here in Toronto. And so again, I said, well, let me just show up to one of these meetups. And because I was interested in Cardano, and there really wasn't anything active happening in the time. This is around 2021. And he was at the time working for Cardano Foundation. So John's been pretty instrumental being here in Toronto because he ran the Cardano summits here in Toronto. So that brought a bunch of Cardano people out. He actually ran, I think, 2 of them. And so that's where I kind of started to then meet some other Cardano people. I actually looked at some of the meetups, and one of them just started to expire because they weren't being run. And so I said, well, let me give it a try. Like I've never really done that before, but I was quite passionate about Cardano. So and I've enjoyed all the conversations, and I actually did some presenting at one of the Cardano summits here in Toronto. So so I said, well, let's give it a try. Worst that can happen, no one shows up, whatever. So I did do that. So that was probably 2 years ago. And lo and behold, a few people showed up. And so that was cool. But what I found, though, is that the in-persons were really the things that causes the stickiness, caused people to really come back. The online meetups, although I had people show up, they wouldn't come back, or it wasn't they didn't have as much commitment to that. So after about, doing a few of them online and a few in person, I decided to just go all in for in person. And so started doing those regularly once a month. And lo and behold, you start getting a bit of following of people that want to come out. And obviously they start getting to know the people that are there, and it builds from there. But it does start small, right? You don't start something, it doesn't start that big. And so that's been fun. That's obviously you came to one of my meetups, and that was great. And I was so happy that worked out. Right.
Yeah.
And I have many stories of people coming to those meetups. They didn't know anyone, or they didn't know anyone in the community, and they've been connected, and now they're off doing either projects with them or other activities. And, so it was just my small part to kind of play. I probably won't do it for the rest of my life, but I'll just keep doing it for a while. The only downside is that the foundation themselves, when John left the foundation, it kind of left a bit of a hole, because there really was no representation in Toronto. And like I said, Toronto's actually got a really good base of Web3 people. Like, there's obviously some great pedigree here, there's a great community, but there's no funding for Cardano meetups or anything here. So everything I was doing was just because I was doing it because I was interested in it. And that is a little bit more difficult, because a lot of the other layer ones are having their funding. They're helping pay for, the venue, some food and drinks and stuff like that. So that's a bit disappointing, because that really helps, kind of grease the wheels, get people to come out and stuff like that. So, anyways, that's just the way it is. So that's why, the meetups I'll still keep running them, but they aren't supported or funded by any of the Cardano entities, and maybe that will change. And I just raised my hand because I was here, but I'm happy to support anyone else that wants to run them as well, and particularly if there's some funding for it. So,
yeah, that's great. I'd love to work with you to see if we can do anything of that sort, because I like what you really I really enjoy what you put in place, because I've been to lots of crypto meetups, several continents, and I just find the group you've gathered in the Cardano space is interesting, because you get, in most groups, a lot of speculators, a lot of people looking to get in on a token launch early or something. But over here, it just seems to be very laid back, calm conversation, people getting deep into the ideas. Why does this work over this? I find, was this intentional, this collection of people?
Well, I think it's a broader reflection of the Cardano community at large, because you tend to have people that are interested in the principles of decentralization, the appeal of academic rigor, and is this the right solution? Is it correct? And obviously, at the end of the day, tokenomics is very fundamental. So I'm not going to dismiss that, but that's actually extremely important. You have to have adoption and usability and all those things, and capitalization, right? You got to have liquidity and all those good things. So those are all very equally important. What I found is the people that were at the meetups and other Cardano communities is that they are like-minded, in a sense that they appreciate the principles of decentralization, the power for good that this blockchain technology can be used for. And that's why I think, yes, when you're there, you're kind of amongst friends, like, automatically. Like, I agree, it's quite unique. Obviously, there's the detractors of Cardano, and obviously there's lots of history between Charles, and, he was involved in Ethereum, and like anything in life, there's always, I call shades of gray, right? There's always different ways to look at stuff. It's not a black and white. But if you take out some of I would say the good parts really around, again, the principles of decentralization, how blockchain can be used for good. Cardano is really up there, right? It's obviously it's a proof of stake, so it is good for the environment. They're trying to do really hard stuff, like the governance piece, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Like, that's hard, really hard, and most blockchains, they have that in some form, but that's not really a priority, right? And the jury's out on how that's going to play out. But the point being is they're tackling the tough problems that have plagued other blockchains, and so that's been, it's always enjoyable to having these conversations. And interesting that the actual meetups themselves, there's so much to talk about, right? Like I was never really struggling. Oh, what am I going to talk about this? No, I just keep going on the list, and we only scratch the surface of the things to talk about.
That's great. That's great. So I think that's a good time. So now we can just get into Cardano a little bit for maybe my listeners who aren't as familiar with the space. So a lot of my listeners actually come from Firecaster, and Firecaster is built on Ethereum. It's an on-chain social platform. So naturally, the Ethereum discussion tends to dominate a lot of what we do. So for the Ethereum heads out there, so could you give us an overview of the parts that make up Cardano? Because you mentioned the foundation, you mentioned Charles. How important are these in the big picture? And are there any other entities that are shaping the future of Cardano?
Right, yeah. So yeah, Cardano has 3 founding entities. So there is IOG, used to be called IOHK. So that's where Charles is the CEO. And so they're the company that built and is building Cardano, right? So they were kind of contracted, so to speak, to build it. Cardano Foundation is, as the name implies, it's a foundation. So it's there to advocate the brand and do outreach to exchanges in particular, and also help build and foster community activities, including brand ambassadors, Cardano ambassadors that they're called. And then there's EMURGO, which is the financial kind of corporate interest company here. So those are the 3 main entities. And so Cardano started, I should get my facts right, but 2017. I may have started before there, but that's been up since 2017 is when it launched. And so it went through a kind of a process. Obviously had a token kind of sale to bootstrap to get the dollars it needed to start off with. And then over time, it then, they made evolutions to Ledger to, first it was just, a token, but then they introduced different features into the blockchain as it morphed. Eventually got to a point where, it could be more decentralized. So Cardano has different eras, right? So in the first era was this Byron era. So that's kind of just exactly how to bootstrap up a network. And this is actually the problem with most layer 1s. It's very hard to start up, right? In particular, to try to be decentralized. It's almost impossible to start from day 1 as being decentralized. So you generally have to bring up a network. So in this case, it was like a federated. So you had a couple main pieces of infrastructure stood up by kind of the core entities, and then you evolve it. So then with Cardano, they started with Byron, and then they moved into Shelley, which was again very important to be able to do staking and other aspects and increase the decentralization. And then it kept evolving towards getting, well, how do we get to smart contracts, right? Because that was really kind of the holy grail of where both blockchain's supposed to be. And so then they come into different eras called like Goggen's the next one, where they allow that capability to happen. They also have another era called Basho, which is kind of an ongoing one, which is really around scalability. So this is natural in any software development, is that you build something and then you iterate and you scale it, right? You don't start initially from day 1 trying to be the fastest and the best. You try to make sure things are right and correct, and then you optimize. So so that era is continuing, and there's still definitely room for improvement on the scaling side. And then the last era was Voltaire. So that's really around this governance phase, because that's been a problem plaguing many blockchains, Bitcoin in particular. Is how do you govern the blockchain? How do you make decisions? Who makes the decisions? How do you reach consensus? And how do you avoid the problems of like some, either one company kind of dictating or, having kind of control, or co-ops the roadmap? And how do you have inclusive and participatory decision making? So that's what the last phase of this Voltaire era is about, and that actually finished off, and that's Cardano itself had wrapped it up with what's called a constitution. So we actually have on chain now, kind of it's like a U.S. constitution, but a little bit different. But it basically is putting up the guardrails of what exactly a community should be voting on and not voting on, because there's obviously we have actually about a treasury is another component of Cardano, which I haven't talked about. Part of the initial token offering when it was created, as well as through fees, contributes to the treasury. And so the Treasuries actually has a really important function that it allows the chain to pay for ongoing maintenance and development activities over time. So the challenge, though, obviously, is, well, who gets to spend that? How do you get to spend that? And that's partly why the governance piece is so important, is to make sure that proposals are put onto out to the community, and then they actually vote on them, and then this is how we're going to spend the Treasury. So right now, we're at the cusp there of trying to get this contract finalized. Going to get the budget finalized. We released the Cardano Constitution in December last year in 2024, and so now it's going through the process of trying to get a budget approved, which has not been easy. So.
All right, so we're going to get a little bit deeper into the Constitution because I know there were a few really interesting discussions that we had in the in-person meetup. So let's just lay the groundwork for people's expectations of Cardano in general, right? So speculators have enjoyed it this cycle, like a few explosive moves up, tapers down a little bit, but we got those big moves up on the back of big news, and it's still a little bit away from its all-time highs. But that was like in 2021. That's a while back. So could you fill us in on what's changed on the network since when it comes to like a user standpoint?
So a few things of point of interest. So the all-time high for Cardano was like 2021, right? And hasn't got really back to that level. And there was so obviously there was a kind of a bull market time, but there was also a bit of a disappointment. The smart contract functionality was subpar, was not great. So it was actually really hard to write the scripts. It was actually you couldn't execute much functionality because it's a very resource constrained. So and the development experience was rather crude. So that's actually improved a lot. So that's good. And when I say that's good for obviously development, lower cost of to make the changes, but also you can make better dApps, and so you're gonna have a better user experience. So Cardano has some very good dApps that are out there. The only challenge we don't have is the amount of liquidity. And that's actually really an interesting problem. Obviously, the network effect is very important for liquidity. This applies to blockchain or any traditional finance and stuff like that. And so I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, and that's going to potentially make or break it in some senses of from a mass adoption perspective. If it doesn't get the liquidity, I don't know how it's going to get that mass adoption, because people that network effect of you're just not going to go to a place that doesn't have liquidity. And traditional finance markets have the same issue today. So
any other blockchains address this liquidity problem in a way that Cardano can learn from and apply it onto their own network?
Yes. So blockchains like Ripple, for example, they do a pretty impressive job in a sense of how to court banks, financial institutions, obviously exchanges. So again, I don't want to dunk on Cardano, but when I do compare it to a Ripple, for example, and Solana as well. So Solana actually I think is probably best in class for communication, coordination, and getting the messaging out there and making those connections. So that plays huge, but you can only do that if you've got a well-working entities, a foundation and obviously an IOG in Cardano's case, working in coordination and to get that message out there. So it does require an ecosystem to be very coordinated and make sure that people are realizing this is the go-to place and listening to what they're saying. Okay, so what are your concerns? I'm going to detract a little bit, but one of the advantages right now with Solana and Ethereum and others, again, it's counterintuitive, is on the native token. So with on ARM base or whatever you have, so with those Ethereum smart contracts, they all have freeze and seize and those type of functionalities, right? And so Cardano, although it has native tokens, which are important, it doesn't have those features out of the gate, or they're harder to do. It can be done, but that's a perfect example where if you go to market and you say, okay, well, I've got this native. When I agree, I love native tokens; they're great. But when you're talking about issuers, you need issuers live in a real financial world with real regulation. They need to have those controls. They need to do freeze and seize and stuff like that. That's just that's just their legal reality that they have to comply to. And so you want to make sure you have a product that fits that and deals with that. So that's why this goes to my liquidity question, is that you want to reduce all this friction. So if you want banks to be using your blockchain, then you want to have a product that they're going to go, okay, this fits checks all the boxes on what's required. And then we're not going to have any worry, and it deals with our compliance issues. And then we're going to use it, and we're going to get that liquidity there. So being very cognizant of what, in this case, it's not nearly the end users, but it's the issuers. What are they worried about, and how do we make it easy for them? That has to happen for liquidity to occur. So we'll see whether it happens for Ripple. They've got a fair bit. When I say Ripple, it's obviously XRP ledger. Obviously, Ethereum is the go-to. It's the biggest right now, and maybe that will keep going. But obviously, Ethereum has its own challenges with scalability and stuff like that. So that's why you have the layer 2s, etc. So the liquidity is going to be a big challenge, and I think the jury's out on how that's going to play out. But if you create products that reduce those friction points, then it should help so significantly.
Now you mentioned products, actually.
Yeah.
I remember, I had my crypto YouTube channel several years ago, and the Cardano community loved that I kept covering stuff like, land registries in Africa coming on the Cardano blockchain. They were very much focused on that utility, usability, using blockchain tech as like this thing under the hood that is less important than the value it's actually driving. So has Cardano managed to move forward in these spaces at all since that all-time high? Because I have the feeling a lot of this market exuberance for what Cardano had was based on a lot of these promises.
So there definitely is, there was some very big projects, high-profile projects, like the digital IDs in Africa, for example, and other stuff. And obviously, when you're dealing at a government level, I think things are very hard to do because you've got many different players. Things can change. Governments can change. So when you deal with national level projects, it is hard to get the win because there could be a lot. You can get a POC, but it may not go beyond that. So those are challenging to do. But there are some projects that do with real world tokenization. So there are projects that are out there. The Cardano Foundation has been working with Georgia and some other places on tokenization of wine and other aspects like that. They're not really obviously significant projects in a sense of mass adoption, but they are pilot projects that are working there. And I agree. This is one of Cardano's strengths, is the fact that it is, again, never gone down, never been hacked. It's extremely resilient. Those are the properties that when you're looking for an immutable ledger, that's always accessible. Well, that's what you're looking for. And that's why I think Cardano is going to find probably the product fit. It isn't the fastest chain out there. Now there is some improvements that may change things, but that's down the road. We don't know. Laos is a research paper they have on really increasing the speed, and theoretically it looks pretty promising, but we'll see. But right now it is not. And so if you look for speed, Algorand and Solana and XRP, they're much faster. They have faster transaction times and settlement times and finality. And so those are great for payment use cases, or in Solana's case for meme coins. So Cardano's okay, but that's, the reality is it takes, 20, 30 seconds to submit a transaction, maybe faster, but that makes a big difference when you're dealing with, when payments, that's a problem. That's too much. And that's an XRP, for example, they've really focused on, between 3 and 5 seconds is really kind of the time that you would need to do an actual payment to use it as a payment network. So on the payment side, they're not doing, I would say it's not a great fit. But on, having stuff that's there, and you can talk about other use cases, like digital identity is one of them, but also supply chain traceability. Then Cardano's got some, it's got some very compelling arguments to it, because again, and particularly, governments or large corporations, they want assurances. They don't want the, things to be changing. They've obviously got a business case for it. They need to have it, a roadmap for 5 years. So they don't want, they want some assurances. And that's, again, where Cardano tends to shine on the kind of the longer stability roadmap.
For speculators and for hodlers and for stakers, what do you think that 2025 and beyond is going to look like? Is there more to come? in like the near term, or do you think that these slower processes are going to be a little bit more of a slow burner compared to the other networks on right now?
You know, it is so hard to say because what I find is that when you least expect, when you're talking about price action of this token, when you least expect it, that's when something happens, right? So you just don't know. So that's why it is important to then, and this is the same thing with stocks as well, is make sure you've got, there's good quality around, you know, the people that are working on the project. Do they actually have a community? Is it real? Is it legitimate? You know, is the traffic, is it there? So that's important because then when the day does come that something that materially changes the demand for the token, it goes. And Cardano's got, you know, has good tokenomics, right? It's a very good distribution of tokens that are already out there. Has a very slow inflation rate, you know, it's similar to Bitcoin. So the tokenomics side are great. But obviously there are many other factors that drive the price. So, you know, all things being equal, it's a good long-term bet. Don't know whether it's going to have that rapid appreciation like we saw at that all-time high. There are many factors, and it's a very competitive space. So obviously, not financial advice. I don't fully know, but I do know that the technology is good. I know that obviously Charles is a great communicator, a great ambassador. You know, he has his controversy like anyone does. But that's important to have, you know, a clear direction and someone really pushing it forward. The headwinds really are the organization of the other entities you need to have. So that, I think that needs to that would be a big help if you basically had a foundation. If you had those entities have better alignment, you'd be much more stronger force. You probably would have the token in way more exchanges. And again, you have to understand how the game is played too, right? You got to pay to play in a lot of cases. And sometimes that's necessary to do that, right? Particularly if your competition, other blockchains are doing that and you're not, you're going to miss out. So the positive side is that it's interesting, right? That Charles particularly, I would say he's a diehard liberal. I mean, he's a diehard libertarian, and which is great, and I definitely resonate with some of his views. And he's backed RFK Jr., right? And so he actually had RFK at one of his Cardano events in the summer. And the fact that he has a really good relationship with him is obviously proving out to be very useful in this new administration because RFK's there, Jr. And so that's been very helpful, at least that he's on stage, he's involved. So that's another plus. Again, whether, ADA is going to, obviously the things are coming out around strategic reserves and other stuff like that. So it's hot off the presses and stuff like that. But the fact that our Cardano's there in the conversation, and you got to understand there are thousands or hundreds of other tokens, hundreds of other tokens and thousands of tokens. So the fact that he's up there involved in this conversation is great. And he's helping drive certain conversations, which are great around transparency of government. Like the government and blockchain is a great combination, right? At the end of the day, it would be awesome if we can change our view on how government works, where, it is our taxpayer dollars and we actually have a right to see where it's going. And we now have the technology to basically have that transparency and payments and see where the money goes. So I think that's a game changer. And if he is able to help influence that, whether it's through using Cardano or one of the side chains they're creating, I think that could be obviously a benefit for society because you got more openness and transparency of a blockchain, but also it could have a positive impact on the price.
If they have announced that, coins in the strategic reserve, is there like an Americanness minimum percentages required for them to be included in this? Like, is this something that you've noticed in the conversation?
Well, so you've got Donald Trump in office, and love or hate him, he has his ways of doing things. And one of the things that I've noticed, again, I'm by far no expert on this, but he does tend to reward loyalty, and so that's where I think. And also there's been payments too, in a sense that there's been PACs and donors. Again, the U.S. System obviously is quite different than Canada, where you can have large donors. both companies and individual donors. So I think the blockchains that are there having conversations, I think as we speak in Washington right now, so they probably are all financial contributors of some degree, and not small amounts. And then also they've shown loyalty, right? So again, because Charles was obviously quite loyal to RFK Jr., I think that's very helpful, because I think Trump has a lot of respect for RFK Jr. So the answer to the question is that it's going to be a combination of both. It's about, who's been loyal, who's been saying the right things, who's been the financial contributors, and I think those are going to be the blockchains that are being involved, for better or for worse, right? So these may not be, in fact, obviously I know about blockchains across the spectrum. They all have pros and cons, and there's some very good ones out there.
I think for the listeners out there, we have covered like the surface layer of Cardano, what makes it good, and I would like you to be ready. Just get comfortable, because now we're going to go deep. You're over here with a subject matter expert, Professor Lawrence Ley, and I really want to talk about the minutiae of Cardano. What makes it special? Let's get into the governance workshop, the constitutional workshop, and we're going to go into stuff deep. So just get comfortable, get yourself a drink. So let's start, I think, with the constitutional workshop. That it was actually a very, very eye-opening experience for me, because out of the things that I believe I've been involved in, this felt so consequential. So could you tell us, for the listeners at home, what went down in this meetup, what was the intention of this meetup, and how did we conclude it, and what did we put in place?
Right. Okay, so I'm going to explain kind of this process from a Cardano governance perspective. And there's actually 3 different big events that were important. So as Cardano was approaching this Voltaire era, and they needed to figure out governance, they wanted to get feedback from the community, both on what are the processes for governance, how does it work, and what does this constitution thing look like. Cardano basically did a call to anyone, communities members around the world, if you guys want to host a workshop to talk about governance, submit a form. So that was the first meetup. This was the meetup that was in 2023. So this would be the year before we had this constitutional workshop. So that was the first one, where basically it was to talk about minimal viable governance. So the concepts around DREPs, which are delegated representatives. How do you vote? How does this mechanisms work? So that was the first big meetup that I did, where I had people from the community. I don't know. So we had about 12 people show up. Some people in person, and some people online. And so that happened in, I think, around May or June of 2023. And so that was to provide inputs. And there was, I don't know if there was 20, 30 or 40, maybe even 50 workshops around the world that all kind of provided inputs into this minimal viable governance. And then that led to, so all those inputs then got fed into it's a SIP, and there was a meetup in Edinburgh, Scotland. So that's where people from all over the world came to talk about this minimal viable governance, right? And a SIP is just a Cardano improvement process, and that's how this was being documented. And so basically, that was a several day workshop where basically you kind of reviewed this. Everyone provided inputs, and that was my first kind of introduction to this concept, where you have a global network of communities. And then all coming together. So just like your experience, my experience there was quite eye-opening. It was pretty cool to see, right? There was people from every single country there. Well, let's say a lot of countries, not every single country. And we provided and we agreed on this concept of what this minimal viable governance was. So that was kind of the first step, because then that provided kind of the framework for what this, who are DREPs, how do they work? And I can talk about that in a sec too as well. Some of the mechanics of actually how you actually vote. So the only thing we didn't talk about that in the first rounds was the Constitution. And that's obviously a very important document. So then about a year later is when then, after kind of it got finalized, how this governance was minimal viable governance was going to work. And then obviously required actually some code changes on the ledger to kind of support this. Then there basically, there was a meetup around the Constitution. And so then same thing, they call out to all the communities who wants to do a meetup. I said, sure, I'll do it. So, and that's the one that you attended, as well as there was a number of, we had like a dozen, 12, 13, 14 people show up. and this was in downtown Toronto, as it's the same location as the last one. And that's the purpose of that one, was exactly to ratify or get feedback into the Constitution. And so what the Constitution does is it provides guardrails into making sure the community as a whole, whether it's nefarious or accidental, whatever, doesn't do things that are detrimental to the network. So and to the principles of Cardano. So some of them are like, we need to have a treasury in Cardano, right? That's a very fundamental aspect. It's by design. And so we don't want to have governance actions that just drain the treasury on day one, right? So if a governance action were to occur, that would be deemed unconstitutional. And there's an actual body that would then be able to veto the vote. So I guess maybe I'll unpack the governance, how the governance structure works, because there's kind of a lot there. So there's three main bodies in the governance kind of piece. So there is the DREP, which is the delegate representative. And what that allows is ADA holders to delegate their voting power. And this is different than their delegated staking, right? So Cardano, you have your ADA as your token. You can stake it for staking rights and get rewards. Then delegation is kind of an additional feature, and it's independent mostly. But the point being is that you then can delegate your voting power, which is correlated to how much, obviously, ADA you have, right? So it's ADA, it's one vote, one ADA. So how much ever ADA is, how much that's your voting power. And so you can delegate your voting power to these delegates. So it's actually once again, Cardano does some very cool, interesting things. And one of the things they did here was this thing called liquid democracy. What you can do here is then you can delegate your voting power to a DREP, and then they would vote with their commutative voting power. But then you can actually change your delegation if you really find the person's not doing what you want them to do. So I think that's profound, because obviously with our parliamentary system today, you vote somebody in office and then they go off and do something, whatever they want to do, until they get, the next voting in the next round. So that could be 4 or 5 years away. So and obviously there's some big issues with that. So I think that's a really cool concept. So then these DREPs have this voting power. Their voting power aggregates up into counting actually the votes, and that will present a yes or no to a particular action that has been proposed. So they are one kind of body. There's another body in the kind of the electorate is the SPOs. So those are the stake pool operators. So obviously they play a very important role. They basically represent all of the stake pools that are, basically securing the network. And so they have a vote, and they can also vote as well. They are really only have votes on very specific governance actions, like hard forks, for example. They don't vote on kind of more minor stuff like information actions and other minor parameter changes. But obviously they have a very important role, and obviously they need to then sign off when we're doing major upgrades. And the last body is called the Constitutional Committee. And so the Constitutional Committee is what uses the Constitution to determine whether something is constitutional or not. And that's where the guardrails are. So there's guardrails, lots of guardrails in the Constitution to make sure that we don't do anything dumb, right? So both, bad parameters that could get put in there that could screw things up, or like I gave the example of the Treasury. So you have those three bodies that then kind of form the government of Cardano that then allow governance actions to pass. And it's the DREPs that typically would put an on-chain governance action, so do something like, let's withdraw some funds for the budget. A governance action would be put on chain, and then a vote would have to occur and reach a certain threshold. Again, those are defined within the Constitution as well, that to pass. And if it's passed, then it passes, and then the funds could be released, and your budget could be spent for that. So that's kind of how it works. It's like anything in life. As soon as you kind of go into it, you go further into the weeds, and governance itself is my takeaway is quite complicated. It's a very difficult subject. It's kind of people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about it. But my hat's off to the people, the diehards that really worked hard to make it happen because it was not easy. And it's still, it's not over yet. It's now we're in active governance phase, and there was tremendous amount of community support to make this actually happen.
How much of the conversation was like, hey, why don't we just do this? And then people dig in, they realize, oh no, it's way too complex for us to just do this because they have to take care of A, B, and C before we can just do any of this. So how many times do you think this discussion happened in this process of getting this constitution ready?
I think, as you saw at our own meetup, it happened several times. People just went, oh, I'd never thought of that. Or, oh, you can't, why? Exactly, just do it like this. And then someone would have a counter argument. And again, everyone kind of realized, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. Like it was really quite one of those times where it's not something you think about too much, governance. You just it's just there, right? And you rarely get to change it. And so you don't really give it a lot of deep thought unless you're maybe a poli-sci major. But yes, I think that replicated itself across the world. Well, all these different meetups, had similar questions. Oh, let's just do that. And then you realize, oh no, actually that has some implications. You don't want to do that. So there was no question. That was hard to get it curtailed, but obviously we did. And, it was not easy, but I agree. It was an eye opener, on, it's a thing that you generally don't talk about. And I agree. At that point, it was fun because it was so new that, and cool. Like, who gets to do this? Who gets to create a constitution?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So it isn't something you do every day. And, obviously, something like the U.S. Constitution is obviously significantly more complex and it has significantly more impact. But, from a small, part in the universe, it was kind of fun to be part of that journey.
Were there any other cohorts around the world that reached wildly different conclusions to us, for example?
No. And unfortunately, the right people to actually ask that would be people like Roger and William, who actually were our delegates. So just for the listeners, what happened at our constitutional workshop is then we sent 2 delegates down to the Cardano Constitution that happened in Argentina. And so then they, along with all these other representatives, basically hashed out the Constitution. So they had a bunch of feedback and stuff like that. Obviously, there's different opinions on stuff, right? There's always going to be different opinions. And it's not easy when you get that diverse of a group through its different countries, different ethnicities, etc., you're going to have different opinions. And, common ground was found, and we do have something that we can stand up, which is great. But I don't think our group particularly, we were any outliers with some of our ideas. I think from what I saw from the Constitution that was ultimately ratified, it looked pretty aligned with what we were thinking. So I guess that's good that, I think we were represented, let's say, so to speak.
So you mentioned DREPs, and you mentioned that you'd like to get into a little bit more detail about what they do. So I think who can be a DREP, and how does one be a DREP? And once you are a DREP, is this like your mantle for life? How does one go about being the best possible DREP that they can be?
Right, yeah. Well, so I say first and foremost, you need to have a community and around you. So you need to have a good social media profile, definitely, or be active in the community. So at the end of the day, you're getting people to do something. You don't get it for free. They actually have to, not a lot of work. They basically, in their wallets, would basically, select you from a list of DREPs, and then, click a button, and then it would submit a transaction, and it would register that your ADA is now delegated from a voting power to that DREP. Anyone can be a DREP. There's a deposit. It's not a very big deposit. So anyone can be it. So that's part of Cardano's ethos as well as inclusivity. It's not, it's not meant to be a gated exclusive club. So anyone can be it. And then the next challenge would be, well, then why are people going to vote for you? So then you probably articulate what exactly your philosophies are, what are your principles and your policies, and then obviously you have a track record. Because everything's on chain, everyone knows what you did. Everyone knows what you voted on. If you think of a match made in heaven of governance and blockchain, they really are suited, because you just, there's no lying, right? You just, you know what your basically your DREP voted on, and then you can trace stuff. You can figure out where things went, and that would be my call to hopefully we get there with when the budget's passed, is that you can trace the money. You can see where it goes. Obviously, there's some privacy information when you're dealing with a certain amount of contracts, but at the end of the day, it's the treasury is Cardano's, right? It's Cardano holders. So we really do have a right to know where that money goes and is it being spent wisely. So to answer your question, anyone can be a DREP. There are some tools online, the Gov tool, where they've got some interfaces there and more information on how to become a DREP. But it's not. It's pretty straightforward. It's gotten better. Initially, it was obviously through command line arguments, but now it's gotten better. I haven't looked through it lately, but that would be the process. You basically register yourself. You get put onto this kind of database of DREPs, and then people can select their voting power to you.
So a major point of contention actually in the workshop was large entities and exchanges and the voting power that they would accumulate, not through actually buying the ADA themselves, but people using them as a means to get the ADA, like centralized exchanges, like large entities like an IOG that may have an outsized voting power. So there was some contention in our discussion during the workshop. So could you walk us through like both sides of this debate and what you think? They probably both have good points, I guess. So could you walk us through like the nuances of the discussion actually?
Yes. So it is a contentious issue. So at the root of it is, there are large entities, large whale holdings on Cardano, like any blockchain. And so they're going to have an outsized influence on the votes. And so what do you do about that? And the reality is there's not much you can do, particularly if you want to be true to the principles of blockchain where it's permissionless, right? You don't have a central control. And so, kind of up to the Constitution, like the entities like Cardano Foundation, for example, they didn't really throw their voting power around too much. So, so what I mean is Cardano also has this thing called Project Catalyst, which is basically it's a funding vehicle where the community votes on projects for grants. And that's been going around for a couple of years. And again, it's really, once again, really cool, innovative project and an incubator fund. Again, I was involved. It was fun to be involved. It was, again, first examples of voting, as an ADA holder, you can vote for projects and stuff like that. So that was great. But up to about the Constitution, you didn't really have any big entity like Cardano, like IOG or CF or that I was aware of that were really pushing their weight and pushing the balance and stuff like that. So it's kind of acknowledged that this would be kind of, they'll stay neutral. We won't really try to sway the votes. But this is the problem. Things can change. And actually with the last Catalyst voting round, that actually happened. Cardano Foundation came in and basically every single project they voted for got in. And I was disappointed with that because it kind of, really defeats the purpose of, let's have a decentralized, in this case, Catalyst, where the community, can funnel things up. You don't want to have a big entity just come in and choose all the winners, which is kind of what happened. So that was kind of disappointing and a bit of an eye-opener. And obviously, people would say, well, Foundation can do what they want to do. Yeah, they can, but, that was really not the point of a decentralized incubator. So back to your question is, so here was, and the timing was quite ironic, right? Because we were right at the cusp of talking about, what are we, this Constitution, what do we do with these large entities? And so I think clearly, it could happen. And it might happen. But the reality is that there isn't much you can do, whether it is exchanges, because exchanges will have lots of ADA. So I think that the best recommendations is have policies that hopefully we agree on, that exchanges probably shouldn't, but that doesn't mean they won't. And I think at the end of the day, there isn't, and again, this is my view, it's not necessarily everyone's, but there really isn't much we can do. Because as soon as you start going down that rabbit hole of trying to have, guidelines or terms or control, then you just start to open up yourself to, who's the arbiter? Who decides that? And you can have conflict of interest. And then, CF can do it, but an exchange can't do it. Like who's gonna be able to, who's allowed to do that, who's not. At the end of the day, and that is the system by design, is a permissionless system. I haven't really heard anything out, but we haven't really come to a crossroads again. But with the Project Catalyst, it was pretty apparent. Be damned. I'm gonna throw my not. I don't think it was all of it, but it was a significant chunk. So I suspect that if something were to come to a head, I think they would weigh in as well on the governance side, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, because obviously they have interests. They're a big ADA holder, right? Like so this goes back to again, a fundamental governance question or statement is Cardano is not a democracy. It's a plutocracy, meaning that the people that have the most ADA have the most power. And that's just the way it is. And a democracy, although it's nice, it's hard to do. Why it's hard to do? Well, because you need to be able to identify each person uniquely. So that's number one hard problem, because you have Sybil attacks where people pretend they're not. So you have the whole identity question, which is a huge quagmire. The second is about, who should, is everyone really equal in the ecosystem for voting for proposals? Some people have much different stake in the game than others. Some people have much different expertise than others. So you run into these problems where, a true democracy for this case may not be in the best interest of the blockchain, because you may not have all the right people with the right voting power making the decisions. So that's always an important thing, that it's a plutocracy. It is by design. And obviously the people with the greatest stake in the game do have the greatest power. So I think anyone going into the ecosystem needs to understand that, and that obviously is not unique to Cardano. But the alternates of a democracy is a problem. Like it's in so far as from a blockchain perspective, democracy obviously in the real world of countries, totally get it. That's fundamental. Everyone's got individual rights and all that stuff. So that's obviously that makes perfect sense. Although some would argue with the U.S., right, with the way they can do funding and sponsoring and PACs and whatnot, skews a bit of the balance there. But so I think where it's really left off is that it's a potential risk, but the incentives are aligned correctly where it's not going to be in the interest of the biggest holders to sabotage their own network. And obviously, if you had some even big exchange, again, you've still got some big entities that I would suspect come in to vote differently. And finally, there is the constitutional committee that can, if something is breaking the whole kind of bounds and the goals and the principles of Cardano, then they can veto the votes.
So do you think this undue power balance could be used to actually push the network forward at an accelerated rate if it's mobilized in that way for those means?
Yes, it could. I think you're right. Yes, absolutely. And so you're right. So there could be a positive outcome where basically if there's some imperative, like so it could be like let's say there's a quantum risk, right? Quantum computer, we got to do something now. And that may be a good advantage where you could muster that amount of support quickly. Or there's just some other competitive advantage. Let's get this thing out now. So, and that's obviously one of the trade-offs between centralized control and decentralized control is the decentralization, it takes longer. You need consensus and all this stuff as opposed to centralized. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So there's both. So, but to your point, that could be then used in those cases where you need to get those decisions quickly done.
So the community has talked about like how there are some essential aspects of other blockchains that don't exist on Cardano, like a native stablecoin setup, for example, or widely used stablecoin setup, for example, like with USDC that can effectively be used cross-chain. Any other things that you think Cardano needs to play catch up on, that they should be wielding this somewhat plutocratic oversight over the network for? Are there any other similar initiatives that you think would be well served by this?
Yeah, the stablecoin is a perfect example. That is it's very unfortunate. So they do have a stablecoin now out. GUSDA is out, and there's another one by MSUD. So they're there, but they just don't have the liquidity, right? And so this has been very late in coming. This is where we really need like a foundation. Like this is, I would say, their role, right? Like this would be the role, is how do we get exchanges on board with this stuff? And so there's been some history too there on why that, USDC Circle was talking to Cardano. I mean, nothing happened. So we don't really know why that didn't happen. Partly, there's rumors that there was an actual fee, several $1 million to do it. So maybe they didn't want to pay the fee. Or maybe there was technical limitations at the time. Again, the fact that this goes back to my earlier point around tokens on EVM chains. It's a programmable system, right? So it's just by nature, you can do whatever. Freeze, oh, no problem, done. Seize, no problem. Rollback, no problem. Like it's part of there's obviously trade-offs because it's a different way of operating these tokens. They're not native, but you do have those functionalities that are very useful for compliance perspective out of the box, like more or less. From a standards perspective of a token, it's there. So I think that probably played an influence as well. But absolutely, the lack of stablecoin and stablecoin volume is going to affect. It's a vicious cycle because you need that for more liquidity. Liquidity needs the stablecoin. Stablecoin needs liquidity. So that is something that I would be probably fundamentally important, particularly if Cardano itself wants to grow its DeFi ecosystem. It needs that. Right now, it's just a drop in the bucket when compared to the other ecosystems. And so your DeFi system will never grow big unless it has a good stablecoin in. So we'll see. So there's some questions around, there's been lots of talk around RLUSD, which is the Ripple stablecoin, bringing that over to Cardano. That's something is a sore spot from a DeFi perspective is a stablecoin.
Would key figures in the space like Charles be able to sort of bridge this gap in some way using influence, using that presence that they bring to the discussion? Like, would it be possible, or should we be trying to, decentralize this influence that's being wielded by members of the community?
Well, it's a good question. So Charles has definitely felt that this is an important issue too, right? But obviously he's involved in many, many, many things, right? And I don't know how many times you go back to the one guy, right? So obviously the community has stepped up with different stable coins. EMURGO is another one. This is in their wheelhouse. They've had some issues. They've tried to do this for a few years now. Again, it wasn't easy too. Like you also have to have the backdrop that the U.S. regulatory environment is just god awful for any type of clarity and operating. So that's been really bad for trying to do stable coins, for example. Like, so Tether, obviously it's there. Yeah, it's, but it's like outside of the realm of the jurisdiction of the U.S. So if you're trying to get to the U.S. market, you gotta follow the rules. And so that was a big hindrance. So I know, for example, EMURGO had some issues, I think, on the compliance. They had to back off. So then they've reset and they've done it. So there are some, and again, so the stable coin is really like, it's just a tricky one to do as a community effort. And there is one. So like, again, like the USDM, which is Moneto, I think now is the name. It's a community stable coin, and it's cool. And and I give them credit because they're trying, right? They're basically getting it licensed state by state. And you could actually do fiat transactions into their bank account that then mints the coins, right? So you can actually not just buy it secondhand, you can actually mint and redeem directly. And then all their bank accounts are basically on chain. So the balances of there, and it's all through smart contracts. So they can't mint more than they actually own. So again, some pretty innovative stuff, but it's hard to get the scale, right? It's hard because and that's the problem. So I think I don't know what the current state is. It was definitely 10 million or something like that, probably more now. But how do you get to hundreds of millions? How do you get to billions of dollars? Which is what Tether, USDC have, just to put into perspective. And so that is hard to do, and then also the exchanges. And as I mentioned, it's pay to play to get on exchanges. So again, it's a community grassroots effort. You need some funds for this. Now, obviously, we got a treasury, but still, now maybe that's what we do. Maybe that is what we do. I know there's been also some opposition to how those stablecoins operate. Again, having the seize and freeze, and you put all your eggs in one basket of that issuer, right? So the issuer then starts to have a lot of power. Like if Circle says, well, I don't really like that upgrade you guys are doing. Well, what? I don't know. We're in control. Are you in control? Well, we're going to pull our stablecoin. Oh, right. Like, so it's difficult. There's trade-offs with putting too much power into one player. So the jury's out. but they need a stable coin or stable coins with liquidity a lot of amount, so we can actually do DeFi.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, because because the decentralized exchange space on Cardano is nice. It's very smooth. There's a lot of information there. Liquidity, of course, isn't all that much because it is Ethereum and Solana have the lion's share of these like meme coin and altcoin liquidity trades. So is there room, do you think, without the stable coins, or can we circumvent the not using a stable coin to somehow make this industry flourish, or do you think that this is an essential component?
I think it is an essential component. But the good news is that there is nothing technically stopping Cardano from having its own stable coin. At the end of the day, me personally, I don't really care. Like, I do care. I want the stable coin to be actually backed and redeemable and all those things and secure. So security is the most important thing, and reliability of the issuer. So if they can get on board institutions that want to do this, then they should. And the reality is that it's money on the table in TradFi. You can make money from fees. Like it's like, but you're gonna have to have buy-in that this is going to be the chain we want to work in. We have to have a little friction. We have to have some of our compliance concerns. So that's why RLUSD might be interesting, just because Ripple's obviously been on kind of the fringe as well, right? Like, it's been on the bad boy of the SEC for many years, and so they're trying to do the same thing, right? Because Ripple XRP have to have a good stablecoin. They do have USDC, but they're trying to create their own because they realize there's a lot of self sovereignty if they do that, right? If they have their own stablecoin, they're not beholden to somebody else. This is an important part, right? If your stablecoin becomes so core to your ecosystem, then who's calling the shots, really, right? So I think that's why. So if RLUSD can actually get its liquidity, and I know they're working hard, and again, they've got a good team there with Brad and Monica and the rest of the folks. So if they can get that, and then I think if Cardano, worst case, has this RLUSD is issued on Cardano, then you can start solving your liquidity problems, maybe. I don't know. It's tough to say, but yes, the long and the short is you need a stable coin.
I've mentioned murmurs of like DeFi on Bitcoin being made possible because of Cardano, because of the similarity in the way transactions work on them. So could you walk us through how, firstly, is this true? Is this possible even? And if it is, how would it work? And what would we need to put in place to be able to implement this?
Right. So, so where I start with is that, so Cardano has, with its most recent upgrades, has put in native primitives on the Cardano blockchain. So smart contracts can basically evaluate signatures that are similar to Bitcoin. So what this means is that you can have a private key, and that private key can drive to addresses on different chains. It can be, whether it's Cardano or Bitcoin or even Ethereum. They use different signatures. But what this change in the smart contract allows us to do some verification of signatures. So if we can verify transactions to see if they actually happen or not. So what this kind of then does is opens the door to basically, on Cardano's side, we can actually verify to see if is this transaction legitimate? And what a transaction does is it basically signs, inputs and outputs or something to spend, and it's signed by the private key of, that corresponds to the address, right? They're authorized to spend the funds. So what that means is that then on Cardano, you can have smart contracts that can verify that, a person is authorized to spend funds on Bitcoin. Now, you still need some type of communication to make sure that that transaction actually got into the blocks on Bitcoin. But you can do a lot of stuff like that. That would be just the last step, right? Like that would just to make sure it has the finality and whatnot. But you can actually understand more about what was the nature of the transaction, like what was funds sent, was what the amount was that were agreed, was the swap, what tokens were swapped in, and to what address and stuff like that. And it was signed by the appropriate people. Again, the signing is the key here because that's what authorizes transactions. And so what that could allow at Cardano to do Bitcoin DeFi, you basically have a Bitcoin user be basically using their own wallet But the DApp, which is kind of the web component, would actually talk to the Cardano blockchain when it comes to the executing the swap or executing the DeFi application. And then on the Bitcoin side, you would lock it into an address that corresponds to the smart contract. So, from a user perspective, it would be a seamless experience. You would still be on Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin would go to an address, but that address would map to the smart contract on the Cardano side. And then, so the Cardano is where then the DeFi would happen. And then conversely, if you wanted to then get your amount back, you basically, there would be a corresponding address on the Bitcoin side. So, right. So you can basically have two people, on Bitcoin, they both have their tokens locked at addresses, but they're matching back to a smart contract. So the logic is actually run on Cardano side. And then that can help dictate whether something gets, occurs. Again, you're still going to need a bit of communication to understand whether a transaction is accepted into a block on the Bitcoin side. And this is being worked on, so maybe things are going to change slightly, but that's kind of the idea on the fact that you basically verify signatures on the Cardano side, so you can kind of know that something has happened, and you just now need, the only thing you're waiting for really is that confirmation in the block that something has happened to kind of do the final settlement. So you're going to leverage the Cardano DeFi kind of application that's going to do the matching and stuff like that and do the transactions there. So in order to make the actual identify the trade, you're not going to have to do the waiting of the Bitcoin block time. But so yeah, it's encouraging. There's also other technology as well, like ZK knowledge, ZK proofs and stuff like that. So there might be other ways too that this can be done by proving something happened on one chain versus the other. So that also might be an approach too. So it's early days, but there's no question that Cardano and Bitcoin have a good synergy because they both deal with UTXO architecture, which is different than your account based. So just for the listeners, the UTXO model is basically like, if you have a dollar bill and you go to a store and you buy something with that dollar bill, the store owner would give you back the change. And so those are basically considered new inputs, right? And so you're always spending inputs, and you only can spend an input once, and then it becomes once the change or the thing that's returned as an output. As opposed to the account model is that there's, you're on the ledger, you're always keeping track of your balances, and it's not more operates like a bank. And there are pros and cons to both approaches, right? Like, so there's, it's not one is bad, one is good. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So the fact that both Cardano and Bitcoin are UTXO based, it works well in this case of DeFi, right? So because on Bitcoin, you're going to lock in a UTXO. Well, that can correlate to a UTXO on Cardano, right? So it's nice that it works like that and you can get some benefits.
Very cool. And I think no conversation about Cardano would be complete, I think, or any blockchain would be complete if you don't talk about the impending arrival of AI and how it's going to be reshaping the way we interact with these things. So have you seen any initial things that give you cause for excitement or concern about AI's role in Cardano?
I don't know if it's Cardano specifically. I think AI has very interesting implications here. Absolutely. And I think people have brought this up too before around if AI agents want to transact, which is very helpful, they don't want to use the traditional system, right? That just doesn't work. But that's where I'm saying it's not a Cardano specific thing. So what I think is going to become pretty important from an AI agent perspective is speed. You're going to have AI agents running, and the people putting this together are going to look at, well, what's your transaction time? How fast do you need to settle stuff? So that's going to be one component, right? So you're going to look at that. Obviously, the other part is the reliability of the network. Is it up? Does it go down? All those things. So that's going to be important as well. You're mission critical. Particularly with trades, right? Like if an important trade, you don't want to be told, oh, no, sorry, network's down, got to restart, right? Like, so you're going to have obviously some trade-offs there. The best of the both worlds is where you have a highly resilient, robust blockchain that is performant and fast, right? So that's really the it's called the blockchain trilemma for a reason. It's got those three aspects of decentralization, security, and you've got to get it, and it's scalability. You have to, you generally have a trade-off with one of them. So
I'd like to talk a little bit about your time in academia, your book, which is like a reference now for people writing Cardano smart contracts. But let's wind it back a little bit, because you live in an interesting intersection between crypto, blockchain, and academia. And I say this in this way because crypto was sort of born out of a little bit of mistrust of centralized institutions. And for some people, academia extends to this, circumference of central control effectively. So what are your thoughts on this? And what do you have to say to people who may be skeptical about Cardano specifically because of his desire for academic rigor?
Good point. Yes, absolutely. Academic, as well as any institutions, have biases. They've got entrenchment. They've got, preferences and loyalties and all that stuff. One thing that is I think all academics strive to is following academic rigor and processes. And if you look at the scientific method, right? If you go back to Newton and some of the other geniuses, right? It's you had repeatable experiments that had results, and that's how you learned, and then you could share. So there's huge value in having following the scientific method, and it has a number of benefits on the security of a blockchain, for example. So that's why Cardano has a lot of really pluses again around the security, the formal methods, the languages that use to build the blockchain. These all came out and were driven by an academic side, right? So those are all positive. Those are goods. Obviously, the challenge is in the flip side is the move fast and break things market doesn't they want to get things out, right? And so they don't necessarily, and there is some value to that clearly too, right? Perfection is the enemy, right? Sometimes of you want to get something done and get out and then iterate. So there isn't really one good answer here. I think there is some lessons learned from Cardano because they were slow. There's no question. And that hurt because once they slowly got their smart contracts out, they realized there were some problems, right? And they need to be fixed. So that was a perfect example where maybe, again, it's so much easier from, armchair quarterback to make these calls, but there could have been some advantages of moving a bit faster to try stuff. But obviously the other alternative is you move too fast and you break things and you have big hacks. And again, $1 billion hacks happen, in other ecosystems. Cardano has never had those. So which side do you want to be on? So let's go back to the question also around George Brown and teaching. I would say teaching blockchain is an interesting one because what we do at George Brown is, we introduce students to all different types of blockchains because I think one of our roles is to, we have this awareness of these different chains. We have these different trade-offs, and our role is to really educate them and make them have informed decisions. Partly because things change and they need to have the ability to be able to assess and be articulate and have their own judgment processes. And the second is where the jobs are going to be, right? Don't know where it's going to be. In a year from now, things can change a lot. So we want to give them a good breadth of knowledge so then they can pivot as they see fit, as they can get the jobs or pursue careers in areas that they want to go. Particularly in the George Brown program, we're pretty open. We do there's a number of Ethereum. We do teach a lot of smart contracts for EVM, but we also open up for other blockchains as well. So we do teach all that, about 4 or 5 other blockchains. We go into, but not too much detail into the smart contracts in those blockchains. But that's our role, is to open things up. And from an academic perspective, when you finish, you're going to, okay, good. I've got a pretty good handle of what, of the who's who in the zoo. Again, it's a big zoo, so we can't really talk about everyone, but give enough reference points that then they can figure out, oh yeah, it's one of those, or it's this one, right? That's kind of the key that we're trying to achieve.
Because the space moves so fast, right? So I think, okay, it moves fast and you can teach people what's happening, but you've also written books about this stuff that also changes fast. So how do you filter for what you think is going to be like a message that resonates not just now, but in 4 years' time, versus, something that it might just be a temporary distraction and a hype cycle. Like, how do you tell what warrants inclusion in educational materials?
Right. So on the book side, so for that one, that was just a passion. I had just spent a lot of, I already spent like a good year or two unearthing everything about Cardano smart contracts. So I said, well, I'm one of these guys that I just like to tinker. I like to see how things work, and then I like to explain it and share it to people. So I have a YouTube channel that explains, smart contracts and other stuff that I find out that I think is curious. So I actually did write a little book, and then I was contacted by a publisher to say, well, do you want to write a bigger book? I said, okay. And again, there wasn't anything in the market like it. So I looked at the other books. They really were not not geared towards developers primarily, didn't have good technical information. But I also didn't want to create, and to your point on things moving fast, I didn't want to create an encyclopedia or something that was so dense that it was going to be completely obsolete within a year. So I took kind of the road that, look, my objective is just how do you make it easier to build on Cardano? And that was really what the book focused on. So I made some very choice decisions. I didn't talk about Haskell for writing smart contracts because I don't find that a very easy way to onboard developers. Haskell, I'm okay with that. It's fine. But, you're going to get way better traction and way better dev experience with using languages that people are familiar with. I focused on stuff that was more similar to what they were like. So I focused on Aiken and I focused on Helios. So I just went through there and again, created some basic examples that would probably, stand a bit of test of time. It's not going to last forever. I knew it. So I had to put that, and then obviously I had to provide a bit more general information on blockchain and cryptography, and that obviously is not going to change significantly. And then obviously just the ecosystem itself. So the book itself is, again, it's got probably a third, kind of cryptography, blockchain basics that's not going to change, a third around the ecosystem and the players and stuff like that. And that's not going to significantly change too much. And then a third is going to have some examples. And again, they're not hugely sophisticated examples. So the principles are still accurate today. Obviously there are new versions and stuff like that. So that's that. But if you look at this, you can still use them. They're still usable. But there are some new versions of the software, new versions of the toolkits and stuff like that, that it doesn't have anymore. It doesn't have those new features. There was other books out there, but they really weren't good for onboarding developers, in my opinion. So.
Okay. So when you're surrounded by students all day, you're teaching them about these principles of blockchain tech, have you had any moments you're like, oh, wow, this outsider perspective of someone who just learned these new tools has given us a lot of insight here? Have you found any situation like this, or is it very much iterating and building on tech and ideas that already exist right now?
No, so this is one of the joys I like about teaching is absolutely, it's you get definitely fresh perspectives. So there's obviously some things that are similar and maybe repetitive in some areas, but generally speaking, the students come with pretty neat ideas, and I encourage them to kind of explore the boundaries and don't just cover, something that's already been covered many times before. So that's helpful. And part of it is a lot of it is they do research projects. So they look into different things. I'm not really a big fan of go to a research project and then submit it to me and everyone's in their little silos. I don't think that's very effective and kind of a waste of an opportunity. What's more interesting is have people go off, work on stuff, come back, and then present it to the class. So we all learn collectively about, I didn't know about that. Oh, that's interesting. And I'm in the case, sometimes there's things I don't know everything. So there's certain things that I learn as well from the students by doing their own research and coming back. So, and then we try to adapt the course. We have to, so as new technology kind of, and new demands both on technology changes as well as employment demands. What are people looking for? So we're keeping an eye on that. That is a factor. And that's the difference between a college and a university. So a college, it's a 1-year certificate program. It basically has 2 kind of school semesters and then a third is a co-op term or work placement term. So it's a full year program, but it's applied. So we really want to, we talk about some theory, but we really want to get people hands-on trying, building smart contracts, creating decentralized apps, having the keys, signing the keys, all the things you would do when you're actually interacting with the blockchain. So that's really important. And our employers, and the feedback I get has been pretty good so far, because they're still students, they're still new, but they've been exposed to a lot of the tooling that you would use. And the one other thing I would add is the students aren't typically they're not high school students. These students are generally, they come from other fields. So they either have a technical degree, whether it's a computer science degree or some other technical engineering degree, or they have industry work experience, they're developers, and they want to level up their blockchain knowledge. So that's what they do. They come here, and then we just there is a lot of benefits to basically having, experts. So we have a number of really good staff. Here's what you need to know, and just open up the fire hose. And so they get a broad breadth of knowledge. And then they also network. They network within themselves, they network within the community, they network with the professors. And I'm quite active in encouraging them to come out to these Toronto meetups, because there's lots of interesting people. And that's where they're going to find their next job, right? Is through the connections, not just, submitting a resume, is actually meeting people, meeting other classmates. A lot of them go off to try to start companies, not easy. Not all of them can do it. But with enough persistence, it's going to work for some of them.
So is there any insight that you have on the demands of the workforce right now, that if someone is looking to get into blockchain from an existing career path, where do you think there is the greatest need from the industry for people of a certain profile? And also maybe an easier translation of where one is to a position in the blockchain stack effectively.
So it depends on where you come from, obviously. So from a developer perspective, those skills they all translate well, but from a developer perspective, it translates very well. That you need to have, it's very helpful. Blockchain is a complicated technology. So if you have a developer background, it's much easier for you to pick up the kind of the technology pieces and then be able to be useful for an employer. You generally aren't just going to write a smart contract and be done. You're going to, 90% of adapt development is the off-chain pieces, and particularly on the UTXO model. In the EVM, it's a little different, so it's less, but you spend a lot of work on the off-chain. Nothing, how are, all the pieces around how it's going to interact with the blockchain and the user experience and on that app. So those are all developer skills. So those are all useful. And there are two different kind of paths in our program. So there's that technical track where you have those developers, and then they level up with their blockchain knowledge so they can, basically use their developer skills to build blockchain applications. Then there is the other types of the marketing side and business side. And the split what we're seeing about is about, 70% technical, 30% more business. But what they're good at, and rightly so, is they understand then the technology. So then there's so many roles in the non-technical space, whether it is on the marketing side, social media side, social manager, developer relations, you just go on and on and on. It's great and this is what I hear from employers as well, is great to have people that have those communication skills and understand the technology, and then can work with developers and understand things under the hood, and not experts at it, but they understand enough that they can talk with development teams, and that's huge. Or they're going to start their own company. Same thing, right? It's nice for them to have the exposure, understand, okay, what exactly happened at a technical side, and then I can decide what I'm comfortable with. Do I want to do the development myself, or am I going to bring in a developer to my team or whatnot? So that's kind of how you've got different paths, you're technical or you're non-technical. And the outside of that, and what we're seeing from a demand perspective, is really those kind of two camps. There's the developer roles. There's lots of need for that, but there's also the need for to get the message. Communication is huge, and social medias and creating a community. And actually, that's where when I talk to venture capital firms, that's what they want. It's one of the main things they look at. They want to know what your community is. Like if you want to get money, they're going to show me your community. And how do you get community? Well, you need to have a good communicator. You have to have someone on social media and social marketing. So there's need for both of those types of technical and non-technical roles.
So many companies are pre-product market fit as well, right? Yes. So you got to have good communication to sort of build that.
Yep, totally.
Do you have anything that you'd like to share? Any socials that you think, or any resources that you'd like to share with the community that if they want to start learning stuff on their own, picking up a few things, do you have any go-to sources that you think help you on your journey?
I'm a little biased for the Cardano blockchain, although it's getting more dated. The book came out a year ago, but my book I think is a great place to learn about the Cardano blockchain, and particularly if you're a developer. So I just wrote it in an easy way to understand. It's got some good examples. I think it's great. So that's definitely one of many, but that would be definitely from a Cardano perspective. The other one from blockchain perspective, obviously you've got the program itself, George Brown, so you can find it if you go to their website or Google George Brown, the blockchain program. Again, it's the 1-year certificate program, so we offer it during the night class. So that's the part for this is to allow people that have jobs to be able to do this at night school. So it's usually Mondays to Fridays. So it's a bit of a time commitment, but it is in the evenings. Some of the classes might be online, but most of them are in person. And we try to make sure that exactly we're providing value for doing this. So it gives you those contacts, both on what you need to know as well as who to know. And that's the key. And then the last but not least is and like you've done, which kudos to you, is go out to these meetups. Like we're in Toronto, and Toronto's, it really is unique on the amount of pedigree we have here. So obviously I started with my story of going to Decentral back in the day, but there's still stuff like today. There's still stuff. I was this week alone. There was 2 great meetups. I was at one was Newton Community Demos. Saw some people, some startups presenting their ideas here. We had the CBC, which was the Canadian Blockchain Consortium. They had a meetup in one of the big towers there on King Street. Hear from kind of all the big bankers and lawyers and got their thoughts. I don't know. I think it's cool. Like Toronto, it's one of these places where you're lucky to be here because you have all of this talent in here. Obviously, Canada itself has some challenges around the competitiveness. Hopefully, that changes. But Toronto itself, it's pretty neat to see all these people and go to these meetups. Definitely we can put some links to some of the meetups that people should go to, maybe on this podcast. But that's the best way. It takes some guts to go. If you don't know anyone, like we've all been there, you don't know a single person, and you just got to just go and it takes time, right? Like it's like anything. You're not going to just, be able to meet everyone and be best buddies with everybody, but just start going and you start to read the room and you'll start talking and then eventually you'll start meeting people. And then that makes it easier to go to the next meetup. So, meetups are probably the best thing to do, both from the networking perspective, get the inside scoop, not the sales scoop, right?
Fantastic. Professor Lawrence Ley, thank you so much for being over here. Other than, of course, a chance encounter at a meetup, where could your community find you online?
So I would say I am on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to reach out to me if you want to talk about anything. I do consulting for Cardano smart contracts, and obviously I'm teaching as well, and I'm open to collaboration on startups as well for blockchain stuff.
So we'll both be sharing these Cardano meetups. I think if you're even sitting on the fence about interest in this, please come. It's like just a very chilled out chit chat among a small group of folks. It's not a big sales pitch or anything like that. It's very much interpersonal because this is kind of how this network runs. So any final words to the community, Professor?
Well, I'm going to say, Marvin, thank you. I think you're doing a great job with this podcast. I wish you all the best of success, and thank you for having me on here. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It was an absolute pleasure having you. So on that note, from rainy, overcast Toronto, this is Marv and Professor Lawrence Ley signing off. You take care and looking forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.